The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the busy city street. The sound of honking horns and the rhythmic hum of engines filled the air as Sarah and Alex made their way home after another long workday. The city was as alive as ever, its glass buildings gleaming in the warm light. It was a familiar scene, one they'd experienced countless times before. But tonight would be different. Something neither of them could have anticipated was about to happen. The two of them had been chatting idly, trying to shake off the fatigue of the day. Sarah was driving, her hands gripping the steering wheel with the practiced ease of someone who had navigated this route countless times. Alex was sitting next to her, his eyes scanning the street, but his mind clearly elsewhere, lost in thought. The usual hustle and bustle of the city was nothing new to them. They had seen it all before. But that evening, something was about to disrupt their calm routine in a way neither could have imagined. Without warning, a sudden movement caught Sarah's eye. She barely had time to react before a terrified German shepherd came barreling through the open rear window of their car, landing in the back seat with a loud thud. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt in the middle of the busy street. The sound of rubber grinding against asphalt was drowned out by the loud rush of air and the frantic panting that came from the dog. The animal, emaciated and covered in dirt, was trembling violently. Its fur was matted, and it looked like it hadn't had a proper meal or rest in days. Maybe weeks. Its eyes were wide with terror, and its body was a patchwork of cuts and bruises. It was clear this dog had been through something unimaginable, something that had pushed it to the edge. Sarah and Alex sat frozen in shock, staring at the creature that had just appeared in their lives. Neither of them could understand what had just happened. Did that just happen? Alex asked, his voice barely a whisper as he turned to look at Sarah. His face was a mix of confusion and disbelief. Where did it come from? Sarah's mind raced as she tried to make sense of the situation. She glanced at the dog in the back seat. Its eyes locked onto hers. There was something in those eyes, something more than just fear. It was desperation, a pleading for help, a silent cry that echoed louder than any bark could. The dog's ribs were visible beneath its thin coat, and Sarah's heart went out to it. She had no idea where it had come from or why it had chosen them. But she could see it wasn't just lost. It was running from something, and that something was dangerous. Maybe it ran from an alley or something. Sarah murmured, her mind still trying to piece together what had just unfolded. She slowly reached out to the rearview mirror, checking the traffic behind them, wondering if anyone had seen what had just happened. But the cars around them were still moving, oblivious to the scene in the car ahead. Nobody seemed to have noticed the terrified dog jumping into their midst. The dog, meanwhile, was huddled in the corner of the back seat, its body curled into a tight ball. It kept its eyes fixed on Sarah and Alex, not moving, not making a sound. Its breath came in short, shallow gasps, and Sarah could see its body trembling. There was a quiet intensity in the air, something that told her this wasn't just an ordinary stray dog. This was a dog with a story, a dog that had been through something far worse than anything Sarah could imagine. Alex, do you think someone hurt it? Sarah asked, her voice filled with concern as she glanced at him. She reached into her bag for her phone, ready to call animal control or the police. But something stopped her. The dog's gaze was unrelenting. And in that moment, she knew it wasn't just running from a bad situation, it was running from something even more sinister. I don't know, Alex replied, his voice tinged with uncertainty. But we can't just leave it here. It's obvious it's in trouble. Sarah nodded, her instincts kicking in. She didn't know what had led to this strange encounter. But she couldn't ignore the fact that the dog needed help. It was clear that whatever it had been through had left it broken and scared. Her heart went out to it. She didn't know what it was running from. But she knew they couldn't just drive away and pretend nothing had happened. They were stopped in the middle of a busy street, with cars honking behind them and the sound of traffic swirling around them. But all Sarah could focus on was the dog in the back seat. Her mind raced as she wondered what kind of danger had driven the animal to such extremes. Had someone hurt it? Was it running from an abusive owner? Or had it been abandoned in a place far worse than a busy street? Alex leaned forward, glancing into the rearview mirror at the dog. He could see the terror in its eyes, and the sense of helplessness that seemed to radiate from its every move. The dog was clearly in no condition to protect itself. And yet it was still running, still searching for a place to hide. And for reasons neither of them could understand. It had chosen them. We can't just leave it here, Sarah said firmly, her voice steady despite the confusion. Let's get it out of here. Away from the traffic. We'll figure out what to do next. Alex nodded in agreement. He didn't know what had happened or why the dog had come to them. But he knew one thing for sure. It was scared. And it was in need of help. Together, they opened the door slowly, trying not to startle the dog. It didn't move at first, still curled up in its trembling ball. But when it heard the door, it looked up at them. Its eyes filled with an unspoken plea. Sarah and Alex exchanged a glance, a silent understanding passing between them. Whatever had happened to this dog, it wasn't something they could ignore. It had found them, and now they had to do what they could to help. As Sarah gently reached out to the trembling animal, she realized that this wasn't just a random encounter. It was a moment that would change their lives in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. The dog had chosen him for a reason, and the story behind its terror was only just beginning to unfold. The dog was motionless in the back seat, its large brown eyes staring at Sarah and Alex with a look that seemed to be both full of terror and pleading. The silence between them was palpable, broken only by the sound of the faint wind and the distant hum of traffic. Sarah's hands were still gripping the steering wheel, her fingers tight with tension as she tried to process what had just happened. The sun was nearly set now, casting a soft orange glow over the glass buildings around them. And yet all Sarah could focus on was the dog. It was a German shepherd. But it was nothing like the kind of strong, confident dog she had seen in the past. This one looked frail, its ribs showing through its thin coat, its fur matted and filthy, as though it had been wandering for days, maybe longer. Sarah took a slow breath, her heart going out to the creature in the back seat. It was clear that it was scared. But it wasn't just any kind of fear. There was something deeper in those eyes, a kind of panic. As if it had been running from something much worse than the fear of being lost. Alex turned to look at her. His face filled with concern. "Sarah, what do we do now? I mean, it's a stray, right? Shouldn't we just drive on and let animal control handle it?" His voice was hesitant, unsure. He wasn't heartless. He saw the fear in the dog's eyes too, but there was a hesitation that came from not knowing what this situation might mean. He had never been one to take risks. And this was a risk. "We can't just drive off and leave it here," Sarah said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. She glanced back at the dog, who hadn't moved an inch since it had landed in the car. "Look at it, Alex. It's not just some hungry stray. It's terrified. Something's happened to it, and we can't just pretend we didn't see it." Alex's brow furrowed, and he sighed deeply. He could feel Sarah's determination, and he knew that once she made up her mind, there wasn't much he could do to change it. But his concern lingered. "I don't know," he said softly, "taking in a stray. What if it's dangerous? We don't know where it's been, what it's been through. It could have all sorts of diseases, or what if it attacks us? We're not equipped for this." "Sarah." He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly struggling with the idea. Sarah paused, her gaze never leaving the dog. She understood Alex's worries. They had both grown up in the city, and while they had seen their fair share of stray animals, nothing had ever come close to what they were facing now. This wasn't just a dog looking for a meal. It was a dog that looked like it had been through hell and back. The way it trembled in the back seat, its eyes darting around, made her feel an unspoken connection to it. It was as if the dog was asking them for help. And Sarah knew she couldn't turn her back on that plea. "I know what you're thinking," she said, her voice soft but firm. "And I'm not saying we should just take it home without a plan. But we can't leave it in the state it's in. What if it's running from something dangerous? We can't just assume it's fine to drive away and forget about it." Alex remained silent for a moment, still watching the dog. There was something about the way it kept its distance. Its body language closed off but tense, as though it didn't trust them fully yet, but didn't have the strength to run either. Alex couldn't ignore the way the dog looked at him. There was something desperate in those eyes, something that reached deep inside him. But the fear was still there, too, and that fear unsettled him. But what if it's more than just a scared dog? Alex finally spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if it's running from something? Something that could put us in danger too?" Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine at the thought, but she didn't let it show. Alex was right. Of course. There was something about this whole situation that didn't sit right with her. The dog didn't look like any stray she had ever seen. It wasn't just hungry or lost. It was running from something. And that something could be dangerous. But she couldn't ignore the pull she felt to help. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that leaving this dog behind wasn't an option. She had to help it, even if it meant taking a risk. "I don't know what it's running from," Sarah said slowly, her voice filled with resolve. "But I know it needs help. And I'm not just going to leave it here, in the middle of the street, with no one to care for it." We can take it somewhere safe. Get it checked out. And go from there." Alex didn't respond right away. His hands fidgeting with the seatbelt. He wasn't sure about this. He didn't know the dog's history, its behavior, or whether helping it would put them in a worse situation. But he could see Sarah's determination. And there was a part of him that agreed. The dog was in pain. And they had the power to make things better, even if it meant stepping out of their comfort zone. With a resigned sigh, Alex nodded. "All right, let's take it somewhere safe." Sarah smiled, a small but genuine smile, and shifted the car into gear. As she drove slowly down the street, she couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror at the dog. It was still curled up in the back seat, its eyes wide, its body tense, but it was no longer shaking quite as badly. It seemed to be slowly calming down, though still alert, still watching them with an intensity that was both unnerving and heartbreaking. Sarah glanced over at Alex, who seemed lost in thought. His gaze focused on the road ahead. He had agreed to help, but she could see the worry in his expression. "Do you think we're doing the right thing?" he asked, breaking the silence. "I mean, this could be a bigger problem than we realize." Sarah nodded, though she wasn't sure of the answer. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I do know one thing. This dog didn't choose us by accident. It's running from something, Alex. And whatever it is, it's something bad. We can't just turn our backs on it." As they continued driving, both of them felt the weight of the unknown pressing in on them. The city was still bustling, the evening rush hour in full swing. But in their car, it felt like the world had narrowed to just the two of them and the scared dog in the back seat. They didn't know what kind of danger they were walking into. But they did know that this was no ordinary stray. This was a creature desperate for safety, desperate for help, and it had chosen them. For reasons neither of them could understand. They were now responsible for what happened next. Sarah just hoped they were making the right choice. As Sarah and Alex drove through the familiar streets of their neighborhood, their minds were filled with uncertainty. The weight of the decision to bring the dog home was heavy on both of them. But there was no turning back now. The dog, still trembling in the back seat, seemed to sense the shift in the air, the change in direction, but it made no attempt to move. It was as if it had given up, trusting them to lead the way. Even though Sarah could feel the tenseness in its body, the drive home felt like an eternity. With neither Sarah nor Alex speaking much, they both had questions swirling in their minds. Questions they couldn't answer yet. But the need to help outweighed the fear of the unknown. As they pulled into the driveway and parked the car, the setting sun was now nothing more than a faint, lingering glow on the horizon. Sarah turned off the engine and took a deep breath. Glancing over at Alex, she could see the doubt in his eyes, but also the same unspoken understanding. He, too, was questioning their decision, but there was something in both of their hearts that told them it was the right one. "Let's just get him inside," Sarah said softly, her voice filled with determination. Alex nodded, still unsure of what they were stepping into. He knew bringing a stray dog into their home could be a risk. They didn't know its history, its behavior, or what kind of danger it might bring with it. But it was clear the dog needed help. And if they could give it a safe place to recover, then they would. Sarah slowly opened the car door and stepped out. The dog hadn't moved since they had stopped in the driveway. And Sarah glanced back to see it still curled up, its eyes wide and full of fear. She gently reached out her hand, trying to calm the dog with her voice. "It's okay," she murmured. "We're just going to get you inside. You're safe now." But even her soft words didn't seem to ease the dog's anxiety. It flinched at the slightest movement. Its body taut, ready to flee at a moment's notice. Alex stepped around the car, coming to stand by Sarah. He could see the same fear in the dog's eyes that he had seen earlier. But now there was something else, something more desperate. As if the dog was too exhausted to keep running. "How do we get him inside?" Alex asked quietly, his voice tinged with concern. "I don't think he's going to just follow us." Sarah took a slow breath and nodded. "We'll take it slow. We just need to give him some time. He's scared, but he'll come around." They both carefully approached the back seat, moving slowly so as not to startle the dog. Sarah crouched down, offering her hand to the animal. The dog recoiled, its eyes darting toward the door as if it was trying to decide whether to run or stay. It was clear that it wasn't used to being around people who were kind. The dog had learned to fear, not trust, and that made Sarah's heart ache. "It's okay," she whispered again, trying to keep her voice gentle and soothing. "We're not going to hurt you." She had no idea what kind of horrors this dog had faced. But it was clear it had suffered in ways she couldn't begin to imagine. With a shaky breath, Sarah slowly extended a bowl of water she had grabbed from the kitchen, placing it just within the dog's reach. The dog's nose twitched as it sniffed the air, its eyes never leaving Sarah and Alex. The tension in the air was thick. But Sarah refused to back down. She knew they had to prove to the dog that it was safe. After what felt like an eternity, the dog tentatively took a step forward, sniffing the water but still unsure. Sarah held her breath, watching the dog's every movement. And then, just as she thought it would pull back, the dog lowered its head and began to drink. Slowly at first, as though it wasn't sure if it was allowed. Alex stood silently by, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of relief and sadness. He could see the dog's hesitation, its cautious nature. It was as if the animal had forgotten how to trust, how to let down its guard. The realization hit him hard. This wasn't just a stray dog looking for a home. It was a dog running from something. Something that had left it broken and scarred. "He's starving," Alex said softly, his voice filled with sorrow. "Look at him. He hasn't had a proper meal in days. Maybe weeks." Sarah nodded, her heart aching for the animal. "We'll take care of him," she promised, though she wasn't sure exactly how they would do it. "We'll get him cleaned up, fed, and give him a safe place to heal. Whatever he's been through, we'll help him through it." The dog finished drinking the water, and for a moment, there was a sense of calm that hung in the air. Sarah slowly placed the bowl aside and picked up a small piece of dry food she had brought out. She offered it to the dog, who eyed it warily. It wasn't the kind of food the dog was used to. She knew, but it was something. She slowly extended her hand toward the dog, allowing it to approach at its own pace. The dog hesitated but eventually moved forward, sniffing the food before taking a small bite. It was slow, tentative, but it ate, and for the first time since they had found it, the dog seemed to relax just a little bit. Sarah's heart swelled with both relief and sorrow. She had no idea how long it would take for the dog to trust them fully, or if it would ever fully heal from whatever had been done to it. But she knew one thing for sure: they weren't going to give up on him. This was just the beginning of a long journey, and they were going to walk it together. "We're doing the right thing, right?" Alex asked quietly, his voice breaking the silence. Sarah glanced at him, meeting his eyes with a gentle smile. "Yes," she said, her voice steady, "we're doing the right thing." The dog finished the food, its eyes never leaving them. There was still fear in those eyes. But there was also a glimmer of something else, hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Sarah and Alex helped the dog to his feet and slowly guided him into the house, moving at a pace that allowed him to adjust. Every step they took, they felt a little closer to healing the wounds that had been inflicted on this poor animal. And though they didn't know what lay ahead, they knew they had made the right decision in bringing the dog home. They had given him a second chance, and they were ready to help him find the peace he so desperately needed. The next few days at home were a quiet and patient process for Sarah and Alex. They both knew that the dog, whom they had begun calling Max, wasn't going to heal overnight. But they also knew that they had to try. Every movement, every decision, was carefully considered. They had to move slowly, earn Max's trust one small step at a time. At first, Max had barely moved from his spot on the couch, his eyes always watching them warily, his body stiff with the kind of fear that only comes from a lifetime of being hurt or betrayed. Sarah and Alex had made a cozy corner for him with blankets and pillows, hoping that it would help him feel more at ease. But still, the dog seemed reluctant to settle in. He kept his distance, even though he was physically closer than before. The bond between them was fragile, and both Sarah and Alex were careful not to overstep, not to rush Max. They had to let him decide when he was ready to trust them. One morning, as Sarah prepared breakfast in the kitchen, she heard a soft whimper coming from the living room. She paused, the sound tugging at her heart. She wiped her hands on a towel and walked into the living room, finding Max curled up on his blankets, looking at her with those wide, uncertain eyes. "It's okay, Max," she said gently, squatting down to his level. "I know you're still scared, but we're not going to hurt you." Max didn't flinch at her voice as much as he used to, though he still kept his distance. Sarah took a deep breath and knelt beside him, slowly extending a hand. Max didn't move, but he didn't pull back either. His eyes locked with hers, and for a moment, there was something in him, a flicker of curiosity. "We're going to make you feel better, I promise," Sarah continued softly. She didn't move any closer, not wanting to overwhelm him. Slowly, she reached for a small bowl of food she had set aside, and she placed it just within his reach. Max looked at the food for a moment, sniffing it cautiously, but he didn't eat right away. Sarah waited patiently, knowing it was another small step in their journey. After a few moments, Max finally leaned forward, his nose brushing the bowl before he hesitantly took a bite. It wasn't much, but it was a breakthrough. Sarah smiled softly, her heart swelling with emotion. It was just a tiny victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. As the day went on, Max seemed a little more comfortable with his surroundings. He didn't jump up or bark like other dogs would, but there was something quieter, more hopeful in the way he moved now. Sarah and Alex exchanged quiet glances, both understanding the significance of every little movement Max made. The real challenge, though, would come later that afternoon when Sarah decided it was time to give Max his first bath. She had been avoiding it, knowing how terrified he was of being touched in any way, but she also knew it was an essential part of the healing process. Max's fur was filthy, matted with dirt, and he smelled of the streets, of whatever he had been through. Sarah had bathed many dogs in her life, but this one felt different. She wasn't just washing dirt away, she was slowly working to cleanse Max of the fear and trauma that had been embedded in him. Alex stood by, his expression tense, unsure of how Max would react. "Are you sure he's ready for this?" he asked softly, his eyes on the dog. "I don't want to scare him more." Sarah nodded, her voice steady. "I know. We'll take it slow. I won't push him." They both moved slowly, speaking in soft tones as they approached Max, who was lying on his blanket. Sarah set the bath supplies nearby and gently coaxed him to stand. Max flinched at her touch, his whole body stiffening, but Sarah didn't back away. She kept her movements slow and deliberate, her hand reaching out just enough to guide him without forcing him. After a moment, Max stood up, though his body was tense, his tail tucked low. "It's okay, Max," Sarah whispered, trying to reassure him. She turned the water on slowly, the sound soft and steady. When Max heard it, his body froze, and he whimpered again, but Sarah didn't push him. She waited for him to make the next move. It took a few more moments, but eventually, Max took a step forward, cautiously testing the water with his paws. Sarah's heart swelled as she saw him begin to trust her, if only a little. She gently placed her hands on his fur, working the shampoo through his matted coat, all the while speaking to him softly. At first, Max tensed with every touch, but slowly, as she continued to be gentle, something in him began to relax. The shaking that had been constant in his body began to ease, and he even leaned into her hands a little. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was a sign that Max was starting to realize they weren't a threat. For the first time, he didn't pull away, he didn't try to run. When Sarah finished rinsing him off and began to towel him dry, she noticed Max's demeanor had changed. He was still uncertain, still wary, but now, he let her towel him off without pulling away. It was a small moment, but it felt like a breakthrough for them all. Sarah's eyes welled up with tears, and Alex, who had been standing nearby, could see the emotion written on her face. It wasn't just a bath, they were washing away the fear, the mistrust, the years of hurt that Max had endured. And in this moment, they were helping him heal. Afterward, Max walked around a little more freely, and though he was still cautious, his movements were more fluid, less stiff. He looked to Sarah and Alex more often, his eyes softer than before. It was as if he had begun to understand that they weren't there to harm him. That night, as Sarah and Alex settled into their living room, Max surprised them both by coming over and lying down beside them. It was a quiet gesture, a small sign that he was beginning to trust them more. And then, after a few moments, Max gently rested his head on Sarah's lap. Sarah's heart skipped a beat, and she slowly placed her hand on his head. He didn't flinch, didn't pull away. He stayed there, resting, and for the first time, there was peace in his body. Alex watched the scene, a smile tugging at his lips. "I think he's starting to trust us," he said quietly. "It's a small step, but it's a step." Sarah nodded, her fingers gently running through Max's fur. "It's a big step," she whispered, "and we'll keep going, one day at a time." Max, still wary but no longer in a state of pure panic, seemed to understand. There, with his head resting on Sarah's lap, he had found a moment of peace, a moment that marked the beginning of his journey to heal. And for Sarah and Alex, it was a moment of hope, a sign that no matter how long it took, they were on the right path together. Over the course of the next several weeks, Sarah and Alex's home gradually transformed. Not in any dramatic way, but in a quiet, comforting manner that reflected the changes in their lives, and in Max's life as well. There were still moments when Max seemed unsure, still glimpses of the frightened animal he had been when he first jumped into their car. But those moments were becoming fewer and farther between, replaced by small signs of his growing trust. His eyes, once filled with fear, now held a quiet curiosity, and his body, once so tense and trembling, was beginning to loosen up, to relax. There were still times when Max would flinch at a sudden movement, or shrink back when someone reached for him too quickly. But those moments didn't last as long. He was slowly learning that not every hand was a threat, not every voice an instrument of harm. Sarah and Alex had been patient with him, and they were beginning to see the results. And yet, despite all the progress they had made together, there was still something gnawing at the back of Sarah's mind, a question that kept surfacing in her thoughts. What about his past? Where had he come from? And why had he been abandoned? She and Alex had never discussed the possibility that Max might have an owner. Though deep down, they knew it was unlikely. A dog that had been through so much, that had been left so broken, he wasn't just a stray. He had been abandoned, neglected, mistreated, and that realization lingered between them in a quiet, unspoken way. One evening, as they sat in the living room together, Max nestled comfortably between them on the couch. The two of them exchanged a look that said everything without a word being spoken. There had been a time when they had considered what would happen if they couldn't keep him, if they couldn't provide for him, if they were to find that someone else was looking for him. But now, as they watched Max sleep peacefully, curled up in the warmth of their home, there was no question, they weren't going to give him up. Max had found them, and they had found him, and neither of them could imagine letting him go now. "I think it's time we make it official," Sarah said quietly, breaking the silence. Alex turned to look at her, a soft smile on his face. "You mean, adopt him?" Sarah nodded. "Yeah, I don't think anyone's coming for him." Alex. "He's not just a stray. He's been abandoned. He deserves more than just being a temporary part of our lives. He deserves a family, a home." Alex looked down at Max, who was now sound asleep. His body relaxed and his breathing soft. The dog, who had once been so terrified, now lay in complete trust, knowing that he was safe. It was hard to remember the fearful dog that had jumped into their car. It seemed like a lifetime ago. "I agree," Alex said, his voice filled with warmth. "I never thought I'd be saying this. But he's ours now. He's part of our family." Sarah smiled, her heart swelling with emotion. She gently stroked Max's fur, feeling a deep connection to the dog who had come into their lives at the most unexpected time. It wasn't just about taking him in anymore. It was about giving him everything he had missed. The love, the care, the safety. He was theirs, and they were his. They would do whatever it took to make sure he was happy and healthy. It wasn't always going to be easy, but Sarah knew they were ready. They had both come so far together, and now it was time to make it official. The next few days were filled with paperwork, calls to the local shelter, and trips to the vet. It wasn't glamorous, but it was necessary. Max was finally getting the care he needed, and Sarah and Alex were proud to be the ones to give it to him. They learned that Max was older than they had originally thought. He wasn't a young dog. Not by any means. But that didn't change how they felt about him. In fact, it only made them more determined to make his remaining years as comfortable as possible. They also discovered that Max had some scars, physical and emotional, that would take time to heal. He had suffered abuse, and while he was more relaxed and affectionate than he had been when they first met him, there was still a wariness in his eyes when someone new came into the house, or when something unexpected happened. It wasn't an easy fix. But with every passing day, Max grew stronger, more trusting. He began to lean into their touch instead of flinching away. He allowed him to pet him for longer stretches of time. And even when the touch was too much, he didn't run away in fear. Instead, he would retreat to his safe spot, but always with the knowledge that he could return to them when he was ready. Slowly, Max began to blossom in his new home. He started showing small signs of affection. At first, it was just a nudge of his nose against Sarah's hand, a gentle paw placed on Alex's foot as they sat on the couch. But soon, it turned into something more, a resting of his head on their laps, a wag of his tail when they walked through the door. These small gestures were huge for Max. They were signs that he had learned to trust, that he had learned to believe in the kindness of his new family. The change in Max was gradual but profound. Where once there was a dog too scared to even make eye contact, there was now a dog who would look up at them with eyes filled with love and gratitude. Max no longer spent his days hiding in corners or cowering from sudden noises. He had found comfort in the routine of his new life, the predictability of love, of food, of care. He had found his place. And Sarah and Alex had found theirs too, together. As a family. One evening, As the soft glow of the setting sun filled the room, Sarah and Alex sat on the couch. Max curled up at their feet, content in his sleep. They looked at each other, smiles on their faces, both of them filled with a quiet joy that came from knowing they had given this dog a second chance at life. "We did the right thing, didn't we?" Sarah whispered, her fingers gently brushing Max's fur. Alex nodded, his eyes soft. "Yeah, we did." And in that moment, everything felt perfect. The love and trust that had slowly built between them and Max had become a bond that couldn't be broken. It was a bond that would last for the rest of their lives. As Max slept peacefully on the couch, Sarah and Alex were reminded of something important: that small acts of kindness can change lives. That giving someone a second chance is never a mistake. Max had found his way into their hearts. And in doing so, he had shown him the power of love, patience, and commitment. This was a new beginning for all of them, one that would last a lifetime.
Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please comment 1. And if you didn't, just hit like. See you in the next videos.